A whale dies in the open ocean, and its body starts to fall, down through water darker than any night you have seen, down past where sunlight ever reaches, down for hours until it lands on the seafloor, deeper than 10 Empire State Buildings stacked end to end. This is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of one that lasts 50 years. We are going into the deep sea today, a place where sharks tear meat in the dark, where worms with no mouths eat solid bone, and where a gas that could kill you becomes the fuel for an entire hidden world. One dead whale can feed thousands of animals for longer than most of us will be alive. If you like strange science that actually happened, hit subscribe, because this channel exists for stories exactly like this one. Get ready. We're going to the bottom of the ocean. Somewhere in the open ocean, far from any coastline, a whale's heart beats for the last time. Maybe it was old age, maybe sickness, or a fight it lost, or a body simply worn out after decades of swimming across entire oceans. Whatever the cause, the great animal stops moving. Its massive body, longer than a school bus and heavier than a fleet of pickup trucks, goes still in the water. For a moment, nothing happens. The whale floats near the surface, rocking gently with the waves, as if it might wake up and swim on. But it does not. Slowly the body begins to change. Gases build up inside it from decomposition, and for a while, that gas can actually keep the whale floating, sometimes for days. Then something shifts. Water seeps in, the gas escapes, and the whale begins to sink. This single event, one animal dying in the middle of nowhere, might seem small. No cameras are rolling, no one on a boat is watching. But this moment is about to trigger one of the strangest, longest-lasting events in the entire ocean. Something scientists did not fully understand until just a few decades ago. Picture the whale's body starting to tip downward, tail first or head first, disappearing beneath the waves. Sunlight still touches the water here, and fish dart around the sinking shape, curious, cautious. Some may take an early bite. But most animals near the surface are not built for what is about to happen next, because this whale is not settling onto a sandy beach or a shallow reef. It is heading somewhere far stranger, a place with no sunlight at all, a place so deep that the water itself would crush a human body like a soda can, a place most people will never see, in pictures or in person. Scientists have a name for what happens when a whale's body reaches that place. They call it a whale fall, and it turns out that a whale fall is not really an ending. It is a beginning. For the next stretch of hours, gravity takes over completely. The body picks up speed as it drops through the layers of the ocean, leaving the world of light behind. Above it, the surface grows fainter and fainter, until it disappears completely. Down here, something is already starting to notice. Long before the whale even reaches the bottom, faint traces of oil and scent begin drifting outward into the water, spreading like an invisible signal. Somewhere in the darkness, animals are already turning toward it. They cannot see the whale yet. They do not need to. They can smell it. And in the deep ocean, where meals are rare and starvation is normal, a smell like this does not go unnoticed for long. Something out there in the black water is already changing course, moving with purpose, heading straight for the falling giant. The whale has no idea what is coming. It cannot know. It is simply falling, deeper and deeper into a darkness that never ends. But we are about to follow it all the way down. The whale's body drops through the ocean like a stone sinking through a swimming pool, except this pool has no bottom in sight and no light at all. At first, the water still glows faintly blue. This upper layer is called the sunlight zone, and it only reaches down about 650 feet, roughly the height of a 50-story building. Fish here are colourful, active, easy to spot. But the whale's body sinks past all of that within the first few minutes. Next comes the twilight zone. Here, sunlight is little more than a rumour. It is dim, grey, and getting darker with every passing foot. Strange fish with huge eyes drift past, built to catch the last scraps of light before it vanishes completely. The whale continues to fall through this zone, its outline growing harder to see, swallowed slowly by shadow. Then the light disappears completely. This is the midnight zone, and it stretches on for thousands of feet. No sunlight has ever touched this water. Not once, not ever, in the history of the planet. The only light down here comes from living creatures that make their own glow, tiny flashes in an ocean of black. The whale keeps falling. The pressure down here is almost impossible to imagine. Picture stacking cars on top of each other, one after another, higher than a skyscraper, and then imagine all that weight pressing down on every square inch of your skin. That is roughly what the water pressure feels like in the deepest parts of the ocean. A human body would be crushed instantly. But the whale's body, dense and heavy, continues its slow descent, unaffected by the darkness or the pressure closing in around it. Hours pass. There is no clock down here, no way to mark time except the steady, silent fall. The whale drops past cliffs of underwater canyons, past drifting clouds of tiny particles nicknamed marine snow. Bits of dead plankton and waste drifting down from the world above like slow-motion snowfall in reverse gravity. Marine snow is the main food source for most of the deep ocean. It is thin, scattered, and barely enough to keep anything alive. Life down here survives on scraps, and that is exactly why what is about to happen matters so much. Because falling through this starving darkness is not just a dead whale. It is the biggest meal this patch of seafloor may see in years, possibly decades. Every second it falls, it drifts closer to animals that have been surviving on almost nothing. Finally, after hours of falling, a shape begins to emerge below. Flat, endless, silent. The seafloor. The whale is about to land in a world so remote that fewer humans have seen it up close than have stood on the surface of the moon. And when it lands, everything down here is about to change. The whale's body meets the seafloor with a soft, heavy thud, sending a cloud of fine sediment billowing upward like smoke. This is not a beach. It is not rock either. The deep sea floor is often covered in a thick layer of soft mud, built up over thousands of years from that slow drifting snowfall of dead plankton. When the whale lands, its enormous weight presses down into that mud, and a storm of particles swirls around the body before slowly settling again. For a moment, everything goes still. The whale rests more than a mile beneath the surface, deeper than 10 Empire State Buildings stacked one on top of another. Up above, boats cross the surface, sunlight sparkles on waves, and life goes on completely unaware. Down here, in permanent night, the whale lies alone on the muddy floor, its massive shape now a landmark on an otherwise flat and empty landscape. Scientists who study this exact moment have a name for it. They call it a whale fall, and they have only been able to study it up close since deep-sea robots and submarines became advanced enough to reach these depths, starting in the late 1970s. Before that, no human had any real idea what happened to a whale's body after it died out in the open ocean. It simply vanished from the world of light and was never seen again. For centuries, people assumed the ocean floor just swallowed it up, the same way anything sinks and disappears. They were wrong. Because down here, on the cold, dark, muddy floor, a whale's body does not just disappear. It becomes something closer to an oasis in a desert. Everything around it, for the moment, is quiet. But that silence will not last. The whale carcass sits like an island, rich with meat, fat, and bone, dropped into one of the most food-starved environments on the planet. Nothing this size, this rich, this full of energy, normally reaches the deep sea floor. Most of what drifts down here is tiny, scattered, and barely worth chasing. This is different. This is enormous. And in the deep ocean, enormous does not stay hidden for long. Far off in the darkness, along invisible currents, faint traces of oil have already begun spreading outward from the body, drifting through the black water like a signal flare no one can see, but many can smell. Deep-sea animals have spent their entire lives adapting to detect exactly this kind of signal, tuned to catch the faintest whiff of a meal from unbelievable distances. Somewhere out there, fins are already turning. Bodies are already gliding through the dark, drawn toward the whale by a smell too strong to ignore. The whale has only been resting on the seafloor for a short while. That peace is about to end. Something is coming through the dark, moving fast. Within hours of the whale landing on the seafloor, the first scavengers begin to arrive. They do not stumble upon the carcass by accident. They are guided straight to it, following an invisible trail of oil and scent stretching for miles through the cold water like breadcrumbs made of smell. Sleeper sharks are usually among the first to show up. These are slow-moving hunters, built for a life of patience in the freezing dark, but the moment they catch the scent of a whale fall, patience turns into pure determination. They cut through the black water with long, powerful strokes driven straight toward the meal. Hagfish follow close behind, and they move in numbers most people would never expect. These strange, eel-like creatures are among the deep sea's most successful scavengers, and they can sense a meal like this from remarkable distances using senses built specifically for hunting in total darkness. Within a day, dozens of these animals may surround the carcass. Within a week, that number can climb into the hundreds. This is the very first stage of a whale fall, and scientists call it the mobile scavenger stage. It is fast, chaotic, and intense, the exact opposite of the slow, quiet decades that will follow. Right now, it is simply about speed, about who can get the most meat before it runs out. Picture a crowd rushing toward the entrance of a stadium the moment the doors open. That is roughly what this looks like on the seafloor, except instead of people, it is sharks and hagfish, and instead of doors, it is the soft, exposed flesh of a whale. The scavengers do not eat politely. They tear, rip, and gulp down enormous chunks at a time. Some push their entire bodies partway into the whale, forcing their way toward the richest parts of the meal. The seafloor around the carcass becomes a swirl of motion, sediment, and torn tissue, a feeding frenzy unfolding in near-total silence and darkness. For the whale, this stage moves fast compared to what comes later. The soft outer tissue disappears first, stripped away layer by hundreds of hungry mouths working around the clock. But this is only the opening act, because underneath all that flesh sit the bones, and the bones are about to reveal something even stranger than a feeding frenzy of sharks. Something smaller, something almost impossible to imagine, something that for a long time scientists did not even know existed. Right now though, the feast is just getting started, and the seafloor around this single whale is more crowded and more alive than it has been in years. Before this whale ever arrived, the seafloor here was practically starving. This might sound surprising. The ocean seems endless, full of life, full of food. But the deep sea floor, thousands of feet below the surface, is one of the most food-poor environments on the entire planet. Almost nothing grows down here on its own. There is no sunlight to power plants, no green leaves turning light into energy the way they do on land. Instead, life in the deep sea survives almost entirely on leftovers. That slow, steady drift of marine snow, tiny bits of dead plankton and waste falling from the sunlit waters above, is the main food source for most deep sea animals. But by the time it reaches the bottom, there is barely anything left. Most of it has already been eaten, broken down, or scattered along the way. Imagine sharing one small bag of chips between an entire school, one chip at a time, spread out over weeks. That is roughly what life is like on the deep sea floor. Animals here have adapted to survive on almost nothing, moving slowly, eating rarely, some capable of going months between meals. This is why a single whale carcass changes everything. A whale can weigh as much as 30 adult elephants combined, and much of that weight is meat, fat, and oil, exactly the kind of rich calorie-packed food that almost never reaches these depths in large amounts. When a whale falls to the seafloor, it does not just feed a few animals nearby, it transforms the entire area. Scientists estimate that a single whale fall can deliver as much food to the deep seafloor as would normally drift down naturally over 1,000 to 2,000 years. Read that again. One whale. Thousands of years of food delivered all at once. That is not a small boost. That is an explosion of energy dropped into one of the hungriest places on the planet. And every creature nearby seems to know it. This is part of the reason the feeding frenzy from the last chapter moves so fast and pulls in so many animals. It is not just about one meal. For scavengers living on the edge of starvation, a whale fall might be the biggest opportunity they will encounter in their entire lives. But speed and chaos are only the beginning of this story. Because once the soft flesh is gone, once the sharks and hagfish move on to search for the next meal somewhere else in the dark, the whale fall does not disappear. It changes shape, it changes pace, and it is about to support life on the seafloor for decades longer than anyone expected. A single whale resting on the ocean floor can support more animal life than almost anything else found in the deep sea. Researchers who study whale falls have documented more than 400 different species living on or around a single carcass over its lifetime, 400, around one dead body. That number rivals, and in some cases beats, the variety of life found crowded onto a tropical coral reef, one of the richest ecosystems on the entire planet. Think about that kind of density for a second. A coral reef builds its variety slowly over hundreds of years, layer by layer, coral by coral, in warm, sunlit, shallow water. A whale fall builds something just as rich, in total darkness, at crushing depth, centered entirely around one animal's body. Some of these species show up almost nowhere else on Earth. Scientists call this a highly specialized food web, built entirely around one narrow, short-lived resource. Certain worms, snails, and tiny crustaceans found on whale falls have never been documented living anywhere else in the ocean. Their entire existence depends on carcasses like this one landing on the seafloor. That raises a strange question. If these animals depend completely on whale falls to survive, how do they find each other? How does a species built to live only on a dead whale manage to locate one, scattered somewhere across an enormous dark ocean, especially when whale falls do not happen very often in any one place? Scientists still do not have a complete answer. It remains one of the more puzzling mysteries of the deep sea, tied closely to how these animals reproduce and drift as tiny larvae through the water, searching blindly for the next whale fall before their current one runs out. For now, though, this whale fall is thriving. Around the skeleton and along the sediment nearby, life is exploding in variety and number. Crabs pick through leftover scraps, snails graze on bacteria growing across the bones, tiny worms burrow into the mud, feeding on nutrients seeping out from the carcass. Layer by layer, an entire miniature ecosystem is forming, all of it powered by the body of one animal that died months, maybe only weeks earlier. But so far, we have only seen the fast part of the story. The scavengers, the frenzy, the chaos of the first arrivals. What comes next moves much slower, and in some ways it is even stranger, because underneath all this activity the whale's bones are still there, sitting quietly in the mud. And bones, it turns out, are not the leftovers everyone assumed they were. They're about to become the main event. Not every scavenger at a whale fall eats from the outside. Hagfish take a different approach entirely, and it is one of the strangest feeding strategies in the entire ocean. These eel-shaped animals do not just tear at the whale's flesh the way a shark might. Instead, many of them push their entire bodies inside the carcass, burrowing directly into the meat to feed from within. Picture squeezing through a narrow tunnel that also happens to be your dinner. That is essentially what a hagfish does at a whale fall, disappearing into openings in the body and feeding from the inside out, hidden from view, safe from competition on the surface of the carcass. Hagfish are built for this kind of extreme feeding. They have no jaws and no true teeth in the way most fish do. Instead, they use a strange, rasping mouth structure to scrape and pull tissue apart, slowly working their way through the whale from wherever they entered. They can also tie their own bodies into a knot, an ability few other animals share, which helps them twist free from tight spaces or gain extra leverage while feeding. It is an odd, almost unsettling sight, but it makes hagfish some of the most efficient scavengers in the deep sea. Their skin secretes a thick, slippery slime, which can expand rapidly when they feel threatened, clogging the gills of any predator that tries to bite down on them. This slime defense is so effective that few animals in the deep sea are willing to risk attacking a hagfish directly. At a whale fall, this combination of traits makes hagfish nearly unstoppable feeders. They can access parts of the carcass other scavengers cannot reach, working from deep inside the body while sharks and crabs focus on the outer layers. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of hagfish can be feeding on a single whale carcass at the same time, mostly hidden from view, buried inside the flesh itself. From above, a whale fall might look calm, almost still. Underneath that stillness, an intense, hidden feeding process is happening every second. This hidden feeding adds to how quickly the whale's soft tissue disappears. Between the sharks tearing at the outside and the hagfish consuming it from within, very little of the original flesh survives more than a year or two. But hagfish, for all their strange adaptations, are not built to handle everything a whale carcass leaves behind. They cannot break down solid bone, and once the meat is gone, once the hagfish and sharks have taken everything soft enough to chew, something else has to take over. Something built specifically to handle what remains. Because sitting in the mud, stripped bare, the whale skeleton is about to reveal one of the strangest food sources in the entire ocean. Sleeper sharks do not look fast, and most of the time, they are not. These massive predators drift slowly through the freezing deep water, built for patience rather than speed. More like a submarine cruising through the dark than a typical shark chasing prey. But at a whale fall, their usual slow pace disappears completely. Some sleeper sharks found near whale falls stretch longer than a pickup truck, with jaws capable of tearing away chunks of meat the size of a couch cushion in a single bite. Their teeth are shaped less like knives and more like saws, angled perfectly for slicing through thick blubber and tough muscle. When a sleeper shark reaches a whale carcass, it does not nibble. It clamps down, twists its entire body, and rips away enormous sections of meat in one violent motion. Repeated over and over by multiple sharks working the same carcass, this kind of feeding can strip away a shocking amount of tissue in a very short time. Scientists studying whale falls have used underwater cameras to record this exact behaviour, watching sleeper sharks return again and again to the same carcass over weeks, tearing away pieces until entire sections of the whale's body are reduced to bone. Unlike hagfish, which quietly disappear inside the carcass, sleeper sharks feed out in the open, visible, aggressive, and dominant. For a while, they may be the biggest, most powerful presence at the entire whale fall, temporarily transforming a peaceful seafloor into something closer to a slow-motion feeding ground. But even sleeper sharks, as large and powerful as they are, cannot do everything alone. Crabs move in to pick apart smaller scraps left behind. Smaller fish dart through the chaos, grabbing loose pieces of tissue drifting in the current. Every level of this ecosystem, from the biggest shark to the smallest crustacean, plays a role in breaking the whale down piece by piece. Together, these scavengers, sharks tearing from outside, hagfish feeding from within, crabs and smaller fish cleaning up the rest, can strip an entire whale carcass of its soft tissue in under 2 years. For an animal that may have weighed as much as 30 elephants, that is an extraordinarily fast transformation. Compared to what happens next, though, this entire frenzy is just the opening chapter. Because once the meat is finally gone, once the sharks swim off in search of the next meal and the hagfish burrow elsewhere, the whale fall does not end. It slows down, and what remains, a stripped bare skeleton resting in the mud, is about to support an entirely different kind of ecosystem. One that will not finish its work in years. It will take decades. 2 years after a whale first lands on the seafloor, the frenzy is finally over. The sharks have moved on, drawn away by other scents drifting through the dark water. The hagfish have burrowed elsewhere, chasing new sources of food. The crowd that once surrounded the carcass, sometimes hundreds of animals thick, has thinned out almost completely. What remains looks almost peaceful by comparison. A skeleton picked nearly clean, resting quietly in a shallow crater of disturbed mud. To anyone glancing at it for the first time, it might look like the story is finished. The meat is gone. The frenzy has ended. Surely this is where the whale fall wraps up. That assumption would be wrong. Scientists who have tracked whale falls over long periods of time have discovered something surprising. The fast, dramatic scavenger stage, all that tearing and chaos, is actually the shortest chapter in the entire process. It grabs the most attention, the most obvious activity, the most dramatic footage. But it is only the beginning. Because a whale skeleton is nothing like the bones you might picture from a museum display. These bones are packed with something valuable, something the sharks and hagfish never touched. Fat and oil, soaked deep into the internal structure of the bone itself, are still very much intact. In fact, whale bones contain some of the highest amounts of stored oil found in any bone on the entire planet. This detail matters enormously, because that hidden fat is about to become the centre of an entirely new chapter of the whale fall, one that unfolds far slower and far stranger than anything that has happened so far. Picture a sponge soaked completely through with oil, then imagine that sponge shaped like a rib cage, a skull, a spine. That is roughly what a whale skeleton looks like on the inside once the surface meat is gone. From the outside, it may look stripped bare and lifeless. On the inside, it is still packed with energy, and in the deep sea, energy never stays hidden for long. Something out there is capable of detecting it, reaching it, and using it, even though it is locked away inside solid bone, seemingly impossible to access. For the first time in this story, we're about to meet an animal unlike anything we have talked about yet. Not a shark, not a scavenger built for tearing flesh. Something far stranger, far smaller, and in some ways, far more unsettling. Something that was not even discovered by scientists until surprisingly recently. Because deep inside those bones, a mystery is about to reveal itself. A whale skeleton resting on the seafloor might look like the end of the road, but bones do not stay quiet for long in the deep sea. Stripped of flesh, the ribs, spine, and skull settle deeper into the soft mud, forming a strange landscape unlike anything else on the ocean floor. From a distance, it could almost be mistaken for the ruins of some ancient structure. Pale shapes rising out of the darkness, half buried, half exposed. For a while, this skeleton might seem abandoned. The scavengers that once surrounded it have left. No obvious activity swirls around it anymore. But scientists studying whale falls have learned that appearances here can be extremely misleading, because bones are not simply hard, empty material. Whale bones, in particular, are built differently than the bones of most other animals. Instead of being solid all the way through, many whale bones are filled with a spongy, porous structure, almost like a stiff sponge, packed with oil and fat stored deep inside their internal channels. This structure exists because whales rely on that stored fat as an energy reserve throughout their lives, especially useful during long migrations when food might be scarce along the way. What was once fuel for keeping a living whale warm and strong becomes, after death, a hidden reservoir of energy locked inside the skeleton. And in an environment as food-starved as the deep sea floor, a reservoir like that does not go unnoticed forever. The challenge, though, is access. Unlike soft meat, which can be torn and chewed by sharks and hagfish, bone presents a much harder problem. On land, large scavengers like hyenas can crack bones open with powerful jaws to reach the marrow inside. Nothing in the deep ocean has ever been shown to have that same bone-crushing ability. So how does anything reach the fat trapped inside solid whale bone? For a long time, scientists genuinely did not know the answer. Whale skeletons had been observed on the seafloor for years, sometimes appearing to sit largely undisturbed for long stretches, as if nothing could touch them once the meat was gone. That assumption turned out to be incomplete, because something was reaching those bones. Something small, patient, and completely unlike any bone-eating animal ever documented before. It did not need to crack the bone open like a hyena. It did not need teeth at all. It found another way in, one so strange that when scientists finally discovered it, they had to create an entirely new category just to describe it. That discovery was still years away when the first whale falls were being studied, but once it happened, it completely changed how scientists understood what a skeleton on the seafloor actually represents. Not an ending, a resource still waiting to be unlocked. Whale bones are unlike almost anything else in the animal kingdom, and the secret lies in exactly how much fat they hold inside. On average, fat and oil can make up between 4 and 6% of a whale's total body weight, stored largely within the spongy structure of its bones. That might not sound like much percentage-wise, but remember the scale involved. A whale can weigh as much as 30 elephants combined, so even a small percentage translates into an enormous amount of stored energy. Picture an entire fuel tank hidden inside a skeleton, spread through every rib and vertebra waiting to be tapped. That is essentially what a whale's bones become once the surrounding meat has been stripped away by scavengers. This stored fat exists for a reason tied directly to how whales live. Many species migrate thousands of miles every year, swimming between feeding grounds and breeding grounds, sometimes going months with very little food along the way. That fat reserve, built up during feeding season, helps carry them through the lean stretches. After death, none of that stored energy simply disappears. It remains locked inside the bone structure, untouched by the sharks and hagfish that focused entirely on the softer meat surrounding the skeleton. This is part of why whale falls last so much longer than most people would ever expect. The fast, dramatic feeding frenzy only deals with the outer layer of the whale's body. The real, long-term food source, the one that will define most of this story, is sitting quietly inside the bone the entire time. Scientists studying whale falls compare this stored fat to buried treasure, except instead of gold, the treasure is oil, and instead of a locked chest, the treasure is sealed inside solid bone. And just like buried treasure, it needs the right kind of discovery to be found. For decades, researchers assumed that once the meat was gone, whale skeletons would simply sit on the seafloor, slowly breaking down through ordinary decay, the way bones might weather away on land over a very long time. That assumption turned out to be wrong in a way nobody expected. Because deep in the bone, something extraordinary was happening. Something researchers would not fully understand until a chance discovery completely reshaped what scientists thought was possible in the deep sea. An animal was found feeding directly on the bone itself, using a method that had never been documented before, anywhere, in any ocean, on any skeleton. It did not look like a typical predator. It barely looked like an animal at all, at least not one anyone expected to find wrapped around the ribs of a dead whale. And once scientists understood what they were looking at, the whole idea of a whale fall changed completely. Imagine an animal that eats constantly yet has no mouth at all. That sounds almost impossible. Nearly every animal most people can picture, whether it swims, crawls or flies, relies on some kind of mouth to take in food. Teeth, beaks, jaws, suction, some method of physically grabbing and processing a meal. It seems like a basic requirement for survival. But deep on the seafloor, wrapped around the bones of dead whales, scientists eventually found something that broke that rule completely. At first glance, it barely looks like an animal. It looks more like a strange plant, or maybe a feather duster, with soft, feathery plumes waving gently in the current, rooted directly into the bone below. Reddish or pink in colour, these delicate structures sway slowly, almost peacefully, completely unlike the aggressive tearing and biting seen earlier at the whale fall. No eyes, no visible mouth, no legs, and no obvious way to move at all. For a long time, nothing like this had been documented anywhere in the ocean. When researchers first noticed strange worm-like creatures covering whale bones on the seafloor, they were not immediately sure what they were even looking at. The structures seemed too delicate, too strange, too different from anything already catalogued. And the more scientists studied them, the stranger they became. These creatures were not simply living near the bone, the way crabs or snails might rest nearby, picking up scraps. They were attached directly to the bone itself, rooted into its surface in a way that suggested something far more intimate than just resting on a convenient surface. It looked almost as if they were growing straight out of the skeleton. That impression turned out to be closer to the truth than anyone initially expected, because whatever these creatures were, they were not simply living on the bone, they were feeding on it. Solid whale bone, tougher than almost anything else scavengers at the whale fall had encountered, was somehow being consumed by an animal with no mouth, no teeth, and no obvious way to bite down on anything at all. This discovery did not come from a planned research mission specifically designed to search for bone-eating animals. Nobody had gone looking for something like this. Nobody had any real reason to expect it existed at all. It was found completely by accident, during a routine deep-sea survey that was originally searching for something else entirely. And what the researchers found that day would go on to reshape an entire field of science, revealing an animal so strange that an entirely new category had to be created just to describe it. In February of 2002, a marine biologist named Robert Frierenhoek set out on a research expedition in Monterey Bay, off the coast of California, hoping to find deep-sea clams. He was not searching for anything related to whale falls. Clams were the goal that day, a fairly ordinary target for a deep-sea research mission, using a remotely operated underwater vehicle to explore the seafloor nearly 2 miles below the surface. Instead, the team found something completely unexpected. As the underwater vehicle moved across the muddy bottom, its cameras picked up the outline of a large object resting in the sediment. As the vehicle drew closer, the shape became clear. It was a dead grey whale, its skeleton mostly stripped of flesh, resting quietly on the seafloor. That alone would have been an interesting find. Whale falls were still relatively rare to observe directly, even with advancing deep-sea technology. But what the researchers noticed next made this particular skeleton far more remarkable than a typical whale fall. The bones were covered in something that looked, from a distance, almost like a shaggy red carpet. As the cameras zoomed in, that red carpet resolved into thousands of small worm-like creatures densely packed across the surface of the bones, their feathery plumes swaying gently in the current. Nobody on the research team had ever seen anything quite like it. This moment, a routine clam hunting expedition stumbling directly into an entirely unknown species, is exactly the kind of accidental discovery that happens more often in deep-sea science than most people realize. So much of the ocean floor remains unexplored that entirely new life forms can turn up during missions that were never designed to find them. Researchers collected samples and brought them back to the lab for closer study. What they found completely changed how scientists understood life on whale skeletons. These creatures were eventually placed into a brand new genus, a scientific category created specifically because nothing quite like them had ever been documented before. Scientists named them Osedax, a word built from Latin roots meaning bone devourer. The name fit perfectly because as researchers studied these worms more closely, they discovered exactly how they were surviving. Not by scavenging loose scraps drifting near the bone, not by living nearby and picking up leftovers. They were eating the bone directly, using a method unlike anything previously known in the animal kingdom. Word of the discovery spread quickly through the scientific community. Researchers around the world began wondering how many other whale skeletons scattered across ocean floors everywhere might be covered in the exact same strange, feathery red carpet, quietly consuming bones that everyone had assumed were simply sitting there, empty and lifeless. But the true strangeness of Osedax was only just beginning to reveal itself. The more scientists studied Osedax worms, the more the list of things they lacked kept growing. No eyes. Living in complete darkness thousands of feet below the surface. Eyes would serve almost no purpose anyway, so this absence made a certain kind of sense. But researchers found something far stranger as they examined these creatures more closely. No stomach. Nearly every animal on the planet, no matter how simple or complex, relies on some kind of digestive system to break down food after eating it. A stomach, or something similar, is about as basic to animal life as it gets. Osedax worms simply do not have one. No mouth either. No opening built for taking in food, no jaws, no way to bite, chew, or swallow anything at all. At this point, a reasonable question emerges. If an animal has no eyes, no mouth, and no stomach, how exactly is it managing to survive, let alone thrive, densely packed across the surface of the whale bones? The answer required scientists to rethink what they assumed a feeding animal even needed to look like. Instead of a mouth, Osedax worms rely entirely on a completely different body structure, one built specifically for absorbing nutrients rather than consuming them the traditional way. Picture something closer to how tree roots pull water and nutrients directly from soil, rather than how an animal typically eats a meal. The visible part of the worm, that feathery, colourful plume swaying gently in the water, actually serves a role similar to gills, helping the animal exchange oxygen with the surrounding seawater. It looks delicate, almost decorative, drifting peacefully above the bone surface. But the real feeding action is happening completely out of sight, buried inside the bone itself, hidden from any camera pointed at the worm from above. This split design, a visible plume for breathing above the bone, and a hidden feeding structure buried inside it, makes Osedax worms almost impossible to fully understand just by looking at them. Most of what makes them extraordinary is invisible, unless a researcher physically extracts one from the bone for closer study. When scientists finally did exactly that, dissecting these strange worms in a lab setting, what they discovered inside was even stranger than anything visible on the surface. Buried within the bone, extending from the base of each worm, was a branching root-like structure unlike anything ever documented in a marine worm before. It spread through the bone almost like a plant's root system spreading through soil, except this system was drawing more than nutrients. It was drawing energy directly from inside a whale's skeleton. And understanding exactly how that process worked would turn out to be one of the strangest biological partnerships ever discovered in the deep sea. Every Osedax worm survives thanks to a hidden structure buried completely out of sight, spreading through the whale bone like roots pushing through soil. Scientists call this structure exactly what it resembles, a root system. It extends downward from the base of the worm's body, branching outward in thin, pale strands that penetrate deep into the porous, oil-soaked interior of the bone. From the outside, none of this is visible. The only clue is the delicate plume drifting above the surface. But underneath, this root system is doing something remarkable. Picture a tree's roots spreading through soil, pulling in water and nutrients from deep underground, invisible to anyone looking only at the branches and leaves above ground. Osedax worms have essentially evolved a version of that same strategy, except instead of soil, their roots spread through solid bone. This alone would be strange enough. But the roots themselves are not doing the actual digesting. Researchers discovered something even more surprising when they examined these root structures under a microscope. The roots were not simply absorbing fat directly the way a straw might pull up liquid. Instead, they were packed full of bacteria, living in a close partnership with the worm. This detail changes the whole picture of how Osedax worms actually survive. The worm itself does not digest bone. Its bacterial partners do the real work, breaking down the fats and proteins locked inside the bone structure into simpler forms the worm can absorb and use for energy. In exchange for a safe home deep inside the worm's root system, these bacteria essentially do all the heavy lifting of feeding. This kind of relationship, two completely different organisms depending entirely on each other to survive, is called symbiosis, and it shows up throughout nature in various forms. But the specific version found in Osedax worms was something scientists had never documented before. Remember, no animal in the deep sea has ever been shown to crack open whale bone the way a hyena might crack open bone on land. Osedax worms never needed that ability in the first place. Instead of breaking bone apart from the outside, they found a way to dissolve it slowly from within, using microscopic partners to unlock energy that would otherwise stay completely out of reach. This strategy turns out to be remarkably effective. A single whale skeleton can host worms boring into its bones for years, sometimes decades, slowly working through the oil-rich material hidden inside. And the more researchers studied these worms, the more questions kept emerging. Every single Osedax worm they had examined and studied closely shared one very unusual trait, something that, at first, made absolutely no sense at all. Every worm they found was female. For a while, scientists studying Osedax worms ran into a genuine puzzle. Every single worm they collected and examined turned out to be female. At first, this might not seem like a major problem. Plenty of animals show up in mixed groups during certain research trips, and maybe the males simply had not been found yet, hiding somewhere researchers had not looked closely enough. But as more whale skeletons were studied, and more Osedax worms were collected and examined under the microscope, the pattern held firm. Female after female after female. No males turning up anywhere among the thousands of worms researchers pulled from bones across multiple whale falls. For a species that needs both males and females to reproduce, this was more than a small inconsistency. Without male worms somewhere in the picture, the entire population should not have been able to survive and reproduce at all. Something did not add up, and researchers were determined to figure out exactly what they were missing. The answer came when scientists began examining the female worms even more closely under high magnification, looking beyond the obvious root structure and feathery plume that had captured everyone's attention up to that point. Buried inside the gelatinous tube surrounding each female's body, researchers found something they had completely overlooked: males. Except these were nothing like what anyone expected. Rather than growing into full-sized worms of their own, capable of independently attaching to bone and developing their own root systems, male Osedax worms stay microscopic their entire lives. Extremely small, simplified in structure, and completely dependent on the females for survival. Even stranger, these tiny males do not live alone. A single female's tube can house hundreds of microscopic males at once, packed together in what researchers sometimes describe as a kind of harem, all sharing space directly inside the protective tube surrounding one much larger female. This arrangement solved the mystery completely. Males had been there the entire time. Researchers simply had not been looking closely enough, at a small enough scale, to notice them tucked away inside the females they had already been studying. This discovery ranks among the strangest reproductive strategies found anywhere in the animal kingdom. Most animals grow to roughly comparable sizes regardless of gender. Osedax worms take that idea and push it to an extreme, with females growing large enough to be visible from a research submarine, while males remain so small they can only be detected under a microscope. Scientists believe this strategy may help the species survive in an environment where finding a mate could otherwise be nearly impossible. Whalefalls are rare and scattered across enormous stretches of ocean. Producing tiny, easily dispersed males that can settle directly onto an already established female may give Osedax a far better chance at successfully reproducing in such an unpredictable habitat. And as researchers kept studying these strange worms, one whale skeleton at a time, they discovered something else entirely unexpected. Osedax was not just one single species. Once scientists confirmed that Osedax worms were real, and understood roughly how they fed and reproduced, an obvious next question emerged. How many kinds of these worms actually exist? The very first Osedax worms described back in 2004 came from that original whale skeleton, discovered by accident in Monterey Bay. At the time, researchers identified a couple of distinct species based on differences in size, colour, and the shape of their feathery plumes. That felt significant enough on its own, two entirely new species discovered on a single skeleton. But it turned out to be only the beginning of a much larger pattern. As researchers began deliberately searching for more whalefalls, rather than stumbling onto them by accident, they kept finding more Osedax worms, and strikingly, many of these newly discovered worms did not match the species already described. They were different enough in their features and genetics to represent entirely new species of their own. Some appeared with vivid orange rings circling their bodies, others showed up in soft rose colours, or pale yellow, or deep red. Some had unusually shaped plumes. Others displayed subtle anatomical differences visible only under close laboratory examination. Over time, the number of confirmed Osedax species kept climbing. Eventually, in a single major study, researchers described more than a dozen new species discovered from whalefalls in Monterey Bay alone, all living in the exact same general region, sometimes even on the very same skeleton. Picture an entire previously unknown branch of the animal family tree, hiding in plain sight for as long as humans have been studying the ocean, simply because almost nobody had a reason to go looking at deep, decades-old whale skeletons this closely before. And Monterey Bay was not the only place these worms turned up. Researchers exploring other regions of the ocean, from the North Atlantic to the Southern Ocean to deep trenches off the coast of Japan, began finding their own local versions of Osedax, each slightly different from the ones described in California, each apparently adapted to their own specific environment and depth. This pattern suggested something remarkable about how widespread this strange bone-eating lifestyle actually is. Rather than being some rare, isolated fluke limited to a single patch of seafloor, Osedax worms appear to have spread and diversified across deep oceans worldwide, quietly evolving into dozens of distinct species, almost entirely unnoticed by science until just the last few decades. Researchers have even found evidence suggesting these worms are not limited strictly to whale bones. Some species have been documented feeding on the bones of other large animals that sink to the seafloor, including fish, seals, and even bones deliberately placed underwater by scientists specifically to test what Osedax would do. That experiment is about to reveal something even stranger about exactly how far this bone-eating lifestyle can stretch. because whale bones, it turns out, might not be the only thing on the menu. Scientists studying Osedax worms eventually asked a question that seems simple on the surface, but turned out to be surprisingly hard to answer. Do these worms only eat whale bone, or will they eat almost any bone at all? To find out, researchers designed a fairly bold experiment. Instead of waiting years for another whale to naturally die and sink to the seafloor, they deliberately sank other kinds of bones into Monterey Canyon, the same underwater canyon where Osedax was first discovered. Cow bones, turkey bones, pig bones, bones from farm animals that had nothing to do with the ocean at all. Then they waited and watched. Within a relatively short time, cameras mounted near the site showed something remarkable. Osedax worms were colonizing these bones too, settling onto cow ribs and turkey legs with the same feathery plumes and hidden root systems seen on whale skeletons. The worms did not appear to care that these bones had never belonged to a marine animal at all. This result surprised many researchers. It suggested that Osedax worms are not narrowly specialized to feed exclusively on whalebone. Instead, their strategy works on almost any bone rich enough in fat and protein, regardless of what kind of animal it originally came from. Around the same time, similar bone-eating worms were being documented on the remains of other large ocean animals that sink to the seafloor: sea lions, elephant seals, even large fish carcasses under the right conditions showed signs of the same colonization. This raised an important point about the whole story we have been following. Whale falls are dramatic and enormous, easily the biggest, richest version of this process, but the underlying strategy, bacteria-powered worms breaking down fat trapped inside bone, appears to be a broader survival tool used across multiple kinds of carcasses reaching the deep sea floor. Still, nothing else compares to the scale of a whale. A sea lion or a large fish might support a small patch of Osedax worms for a limited stretch of time. A whale, with its enormous size and bones packed full of oil, can support an entire complex ecosystem for decades. Scale changes everything here. The bigger the body, the bigger and longer lasting the world that grows around it. This experiment also revealed something else important. Because researchers could control exactly when these test bones were placed on the seafloor, they could track with precision exactly how fast Osedax worms arrived and how quickly they began colonizing fresh material. The worms showed up remarkably fast, sometimes within weeks, suggesting that somewhere out in that dark water, microscopic larvae are constantly drifting, waiting for the right chemical signal, ready to settle the instant a bone lands nearby. That detail matters, because it hints at just how tightly this entire ecosystem depends on timing and chance. A bone falls. Somewhere out in miles of empty water, drifting larvae detect it. They settle, grow, and begin their strange hidden feeding process almost immediately. But whale bones offer something these smaller experimental bones never could. Enough fat, enough oil, enough raw material to fuel something far bigger than a colony of worms. Because buried in that oil-soaked bone, an entirely new stage of the whale fall is about to begin, one that will completely transform what is left of this skeleton. Years after the whale first landed on the seafloor, the ecosystem surrounding its skeleton begins a dramatic shift into something scientists call the sulfophilic stage, sometimes simply described as the third stage of a whale fall. By this point, the fast, chaotic feeding frenzy from the earliest months is a distant memory. The sharks and hagfish moved on long ago. Even the dense colonies of Osedax worms, having broken down much of the accessible fat near the bone surface, are working through material that grows harder to reach. But something else has been happening quietly this entire time, mostly out of sight, driven by organisms far too small to see without a microscope. Bacteria, trillions of them, spread across and inside the bones, have been steadily breaking down the fats and oils still locked deep within the skeleton's spongy structure. This process, a slow chemical breakdown of organic material, is not unique to whale falls. It happens anywhere fat and oil decompose without much oxygen present, similar in some ways to how a swamp or a sealed compost pile breaks down over time. What makes this moment at the whale fall so important is what this bacterial process produces as a byproduct. As bacteria consume the fat trapped inside the bone, they release a gas into the surrounding water and sediment. This gas has a strong, distinctive smell, similar to rotten eggs, and in high enough concentrations it is toxic to most forms of life on the planet, including humans. Its name is hydrogen sulfide. On land or in shallow water, a gas like this pouring out of decaying material would typically be seen as dangerous, something most animals instinctively avoid. In many environments, it is genuinely lethal, capable of killing fish, damaging tissue, and creating dead zones where almost nothing can survive. At the whalefall, though, something completely different is about to happen, because certain specialized organisms in the deep sea have not just learned to tolerate this toxic gas. They have evolved to depend on it completely, using it as their primary source of energy in a process that has nothing to do with sunlight at all. This detail changes everything about what a whale skeleton becomes at this stage. What began as a source of solid meat, then a source of fat-rich bone, is now becoming something else entirely, a chemical factory, quietly manufacturing the exact ingredient needed to power an entirely new form of life. The bones themselves start to look different during this stage too. A thick, often colourful bacterial mat begins spreading across their surface, sometimes tinted white, sometimes yellow, occasionally with a faint eerie glow in certain lighting conditions from research submarine cameras. This mat is not decoration. It is the visible sign of an enormous invisible chemical process happening just beneath the surface. And this toxic gas, the very thing that would kill most life on the planet almost instantly, is about to become the foundation for one of the strangest food webs found anywhere in the ocean. Hydrogen sulfide should be a dead end for life, not the beginning of an ecosystem. In most environments on Earth, this gas causes serious harm. It interferes with how cells use oxygen, and at high enough concentrations it can be fatal within minutes to most animals, including humans. Entire patches of coastline and lake bottoms have turned into lifeless dead zones, purely because of hydrogen sulfide buildup in the water. So how does a whale skeleton, actively producing this same toxic gas, end up supporting one of the richest ecosystems found anywhere on the deep sea floor? The answer lies with a group of bacteria that evolved an entirely different relationship with this chemical, one that flips the normal rules of biology upside down. Most life on Earth ultimately depends, directly or indirectly, on energy from sunlight. Plants use light to build sugars through a process called photosynthesis, and nearly every other living thing, from insects to whales, eventually taps into that same chain of energy, whether by eating plants directly or eating something else that already did. But in the deep sea, sunlight simply does not exist. It never has, and it never will reach these depths. So evolution found a completely different solution. Certain bacteria discovered how to power themselves using chemical energy instead of light. Specifically, they learned to extract usable energy directly from hydrogen sulfide, breaking it down through a process called chemosynthesis. Instead of sunlight fueling the base of the food chain, toxic gas does the job instead. This is not a small, obscure trick found only at whale falls. Scientists first documented this exact process happening at deep-sea hydrothermal vents, cracks in the ocean floor where scalding, mineral-rich water pours out from beneath the Earth's crust, often carrying large amounts of hydrogen sulfide along with it. Around those vents, similar chemosynthetic bacteria form the base of an entire thriving ecosystem, one that exists in complete darkness, powered entirely by chemistry instead of light. When scientists eventually connected the dots between hydrothermal vents and whale falls, discovering strikingly similar bacteria and animals living at both, it completely reshaped how researchers understood the deep ocean. At the whale fall, these chemosynthetic bacteria spread rapidly across the surface of the skeleton, forming those thick mats mentioned earlier. Using hydrogen sulfide as fuel, they multiply quickly, converting toxic gas into living tissue, into biomass, into food. And once that food exists, something else always shows up to take advantage of it. Because bacteria alone, no matter how successful, rarely stay at the bottom of a food chain for long. Something bigger inevitably evolves to eat them, or to form an even closer partnership with them. At the whale fall, that something turns out to be a group of animals capable of surviving in one of the most chemically hostile environments in the entire ocean. Animals that, just like Osedax worms before them, completely rewrite what most people assume life actually requires to survive. Clams should not be able to live here. Most clams found in shallow water rely, at least indirectly, on sunlight. They filter tiny particles of food drifting through the water, particles that ultimately trace back to sunlight-powered plankton and algae growing near the surface. Take away the sun completely, and that entire food source should disappear. Yet at Whale Falls, thriving beds of clams appear directly on and around the bacteria-covered bones, sometimes in surprisingly large numbers, packed together across the skeleton's surface in the total absence of sunlight. These are not ordinary clams. Scientists call them vesicomyid clams, and they have evolved one of the most extraordinary partnerships found anywhere in the ocean. Instead of filtering food from the water the traditional way, these clams host colonies of chemosynthetic bacteria directly inside their own gill tissue. Remember those bacteria from earlier, the ones capable of converting toxic hydrogen sulfide into usable energy? These clams essentially carry their own personal food factory, built right into their bodies. The clam's job becomes almost entirely about supply and shelter. Its gills pull in hydrogen sulfide from the bacterial mats spreading across the whale bones, delivering that toxic gas directly to its bacterial partners living inside its tissue. In exchange, the bacteria convert that gas into sugars and nutrients, feeding the clam from the inside out. Neither the clam nor the bacteria could survive this way alone. Together they form a self-sufficient feeding system that needs nothing from the sunlit world above, completely independent of anything happening on the surface of the planet. Mussels form similar partnerships at Whale Falls, relying on their own internal bacterial colonies to convert toxic gas into usable energy. Together, clams and mussels can carpet large sections of a whale skeleton during this stage, forming dense colonies that dramatically change the appearance of the bones. Picture the difference. Earlier in this story, sharks and hagfish tore visibly at a fresh, fleshy carcass. Later, delicate red worms bored quietly into bare bone. Now, thick beds of shellfish cluster across the skeleton surface, feeding on a partnership between animal and bacteria that requires no light at all. Each stage of the whale fall looks almost like an entirely different ecosystem, layered one after another on top of the exact same skeleton. This particular partnership, animals hosting internal bacteria that run on chemical energy instead of sunlight, is not unique to whale falls. The exact same relationship shows up in other extreme environments across the deep ocean, in places that, at first glance, seem to have almost nothing in common with a decaying whale skeleton. Places where scalding water pours directly out of the seafloor itself, thousands of miles away from any particular whale fall. In other parts of the deep ocean entirely, a completely different environment produces oddly familiar results. Hydrothermal vents form where seawater seeps down through cracks in the ocean floor, gets heated by magma far below, and shoots back out loaded with minerals and dissolved chemicals, including large amounts of hydrogen sulfide. Water pouring from these vents can reach temperatures hot enough to melt certain plastics, jetting out into freezing deep ocean water like an underwater volcano. Scientists first discovered these vent ecosystems in the late 1970s, and the life found clustering around them stunned researchers at the time. Giant tube worms, dense clusters of clams, and thriving colonies of bacteria all lived here, completely independent of sunlight, powered entirely by chemical energy pouring out of the Earth itself. This discovery, decades before Osidax worms were ever found on a whale skeleton, completely reshaped how scientists understood the requirements for life. Until then, most researchers assumed sunlight was essentially non-negotiable, the ultimate foundation every food web on the planet needed to survive. Hydrothermal vents proved that assumption wrong. Years later, when researchers began studying whale falls in detail, they noticed something strange. Many of the same types of bacteria, the same chemosynthetic strategy, and even some closely related species of clams and worms were showing up on decaying whale skeletons, hundreds or even thousands of miles away from the nearest hydrothermal vent. This overlap raised a fascinating question. How did nearly identical chemosynthetic communities end up developing in two environments that otherwise seem completely unrelated? A superheated volcanic vent and a rotting whale skeleton do not sound like they should have much in common. Researchers eventually proposed an idea that connects these ecosystems across enormous stretches of both distance and time. They call it the stepping stone theory. The idea works like this. Hydrothermal vents are permanent but scattered, existing only in specific geological locations across the ocean floor. Whale falls, meanwhile, are temporary but far more widely distributed. potentially appearing almost anywhere a whale happens to die and sink. According to this theory, whale falls may act as temporary chemical islands, allowing vent-adapted species and their larvae to survive the journey between permanent vent sites that might otherwise be too far apart to reach directly. A whale skeleton, rich in hydrogen sulfide for decades, could function almost like a rest stop, letting specialized larvae settle, grow, and eventually launch offspring toward the next vent or the next whale fall, spreading their unusual chemistry-powered lifestyle across the wider ocean. Not every researcher agrees on exactly how significant this stepping stone effect really is, and scientists continue debating and testing the idea using genetic comparisons between vent species and whale fall species. But the overlap itself remains undeniable, discovered again and again wherever researchers have compared these two seemingly unrelated environments. A dying whale quietly decomposing for decades on the ocean floor might be doing far more than feeding local scavengers. It might be helping stitch together an entire hidden network of life scattered across the world's oceans. Step back for a moment and picture the full scene surrounding a whale fall during this third, slowest stage. For miles in every direction, the seafloor stretches out flat, brown, and largely empty. Scattered organisms exist here and there, tiny worms buried in the mud, an occasional sea cucumber drifting slowly across the sediment. But overall, this landscape remains sparse, quiet, and food-poor, exactly the kind of environment described earlier in this story. Then, in the middle of that emptiness, sits the whale skeleton. By this stage, it looks nothing like the bare, stripped bones from a few years earlier. Thick bacterial mats coat large sections of the surface, sometimes glowing faintly white or pale yellow under a research submarine's lights. Dense clusters of clams and mussels crowd around the base of the ribs and vertebrae. Osedax worms, their feathery plumes swaying gently, continue working through remaining pockets of fat deeper inside the bone. Crabs and snails move slowly across this landscape, grazing on the bacterial mats or picking through remaining scraps. Small fish occasionally dart between the ribs, using the structure almost like a shelter. All of this life, layered together, transforms the skeleton into something scientists sometimes compare to an oasis. In a desert on land, an oasis stands out because it offers water in an otherwise dry landscape. Here, on the deep sea floor, the whale skeleton stands out because it offers energy, in the form of trapped fat and the hydrogen sulfide it produces, in an otherwise starving landscape. This comparison genuinely holds up under close observation. Researchers using underwater cameras and sensors have measured a clear boundary around active whale falls, a noticeable spike in animal density and species variety immediately surrounding the skeleton, fading back into ordinary sparse seafloor just a short distance away. Within that boundary, an entire miniature world exists, layered and complex, built entirely around one animal's remains. Outside that boundary, the ordinary deep sea resumes, quiet and comparatively empty. This kind of dramatic contrast rarely appears anywhere else in nature with such a clear, sharp line. Most ecosystems blend gradually into their surroundings, one habitat slowly transitioning into the next. A whale fall, by comparison, can feel almost like an island dropped directly into open water, its edges surprisingly well defined. And this island does not stay the same for its entire existence. Its population, its appearance, and even its chemistry keep shifting as the years pass, moving through distinct phases the same way a forest gradually changes after a wildfire clears the landscape and new growth slowly takes over. But this particular island holds one more surprise, something researchers only discovered by comparing multiple whale falls found at different depths across the ocean. The exact community living on the skeleton can change dramatically, depending on nothing more than how deep that skeleton happens to rest. Depth changes everything in the deep ocean, and whale falls are no exception. Researchers studying multiple whale skeletons across different locations noticed something unexpected. Two whale falls, even if they started with nearly identical conditions, meat, bone, size, and species of whale, could end up hosting noticeably different communities of animals, simply based on how deep each skeleton happened to land. A whale fall resting at a relatively shallower depth, several hundred feet down, might attract different scavengers, and support different bacterial communities compared to a whale fall resting several thousand feet deeper, in colder water under significantly more pressure. Temperature plays a major role in this difference. Even in the deep sea, water temperature varies somewhat with depth, and different species of bacteria, worms, and clams have adapted to survive within fairly specific temperature ranges. A species thriving on a whale fall in one particular depth range might struggle or fail to establish itself at all just a few thousand feet deeper or shallower. Pressure matters too. The deeper a whale fall sits, the more intense the surrounding water pressure becomes, and not every species capable of surviving at moderate depths can tolerate the extreme pressure found much farther down. Some ossidac species and vent-related organisms appear to be specifically adapted to narrow depth ranges, essentially specialists tuned to one particular slice of the deep ocean. Ocean currents add another layer of variation. Different currents carry drifting larvae along different paths, meaning the species available to colonize a whale fall in one region might differ significantly from the species available in a completely different part of the ocean, even at similar depths. Because of all these factors, researchers studying whale falls across multiple locations have documented meaningfully different communities forming on skeletons that, on paper, might seem nearly identical. Some skeletons host thick beds of one particular clam species, others show almost none of that same clam, instead dominated by a completely different combination of worms and bacteria. This variation carries real scientific weight. It suggests that the deep ocean, often imagined as one uniform, featureless environment, actually contains distinct regions and depth zones, each supporting its own specialized set of species, similar in some ways to how different elevations on a mountain support entirely different types of forests and wildlife. A whale fall becomes almost like a natural experiment, repeated again and again across different locations and depths, revealing exactly how these hidden boundaries shape life in the deep sea. And this variation raises an important, somewhat uncomfortable question. If certain species depend so heavily on very specific depth ranges and conditions to survive, how many of them exist only in a handful of locations across the entire planet, vulnerable to disappearing completely if something disrupts their narrow slice of habitat? That question becomes especially urgent once you consider just how rare and unpredictable whale falls actually are in the first place. Some species found at whale falls have never been documented living anywhere else on the planet. This detail carries more weight than it might initially seem. For an animal to survive exclusively on whale falls, it needs to solve an enormous logistical problem. Whale falls are rare, scattered unpredictably across the ocean floor, and each one only remains active, only continues supplying enough energy to support life, for a matter of decades before it eventually runs out completely. Imagine trying to build an entire life, an entire species, around finding scattered islands that might appear anywhere across an ocean, covering roughly 70% of the planet's surface, with absolutely no way of knowing in advance where the next one might turn up. Several species of Ossidax worms fall into exactly this category, apparently found nowhere except on the bones of dead marine mammals. Certain specialized worms, snails, and small crustaceans documented at whale falls show this same pattern, seemingly incapable of surviving anywhere except this narrow temporary habitat. Scientists refer to species like this as specialists, organisms so precisely adapted to one specific environment that they struggle, or fail entirely, to survive anywhere else. Specialists can thrive incredibly well within their narrow niche, often outcompeting more general species in that exact environment. But that same narrow focus makes them especially vulnerable if their required habitat becomes rare or disappears. For whale fall specialists, survival depends entirely on a steady, ongoing supply of whale carcasses reaching the deep seafloor across the ocean. Larvae drifting through open water need to locate a fresh whale fall before their limited energy reserves run out, settling onto a new skeleton before it becomes too old, too depleted, or already overcrowded with competitors. This system has apparently worked for these animals for an extremely long time. Evidence found in the fossil record suggests whale fall communities, including relatives of modern chemosynthetic species, have existed for tens of millions of years, adapting and evolving alongside the whales themselves. but a system built around scattered, unpredictable resources only works if those resources remain reasonably common. And that raises a serious concern, because the number of large whales in the ocean today is dramatically lower than it was just a few centuries ago, which means the number of natural whale falls reaching the deep seafloor has almost certainly dropped as well. Fewer whales dying naturally at sea means fewer skeletons landing on the ocean floor. Fewer skeletons means fewer chemical islands scattered across the deep ocean for specialist larvae to find. And fewer available habitats means these narrowly adapted species face a shrinking, increasingly difficult path towards survival. Some researchers studying this pattern describe it using a specific term, a warning built directly into the science itself. They call it an extinction debt, and understanding exactly what that means requires looking back at what happened to whale populations over the past 2 centuries. 2 centuries ago, the ocean held dramatically more whales than it does today. Commercial whaling, which expanded rapidly starting in the 1800s and continued at massive scale well into the 20th century, targeted the largest whale species specifically because of their size. Bigger whales meant more oil, more meat, and more profit for whaling operations working across nearly every ocean on the planet. Over the following decades, several whale species were hunted down to a tiny fraction of their original populations. Some estimates suggest certain populations dropped by 90% or more compared to numbers recorded before large-scale whaling began. International restrictions and bans eventually slowed this decline significantly, and some whale populations have shown real signs of recovery in recent decades. But recovery takes time, especially for animals that grow slowly, reproduce infrequently, and can live for many decades under normal conditions. Even with hunting largely stopped, whale populations remain well below their original numbers across large portions of the world's oceans, particularly in the southern hemisphere and across much of the North Pacific. This population drop connects directly back to the whale fall specialists described earlier. Fewer whales alive today means fewer whales dying of natural causes at sea, and fewer whales dying at sea means fewer carcasses sinking to the deep sea floor to form new whale falls. Scientists studying this connection describe a troubling possibility. Species that depend entirely on a steady supply of whale falls may currently be surviving on the last remnants of a system that has already been quietly disrupted. This is exactly what researchers mean by an extinction debt. It describes a situation where a species' long-term survival has already been seriously threatened by some change in its environment, but the actual disappearance of that species has not happened yet, simply because the process unfolds slowly, sometimes over multiple generations. In other words, a species can already be doomed, in a sense, without anyone realizing it yet, because the full consequences of a shrinking habitat can take decades to fully play out. For whalefall specialists, that means the reduced number of whalefalls happening today, a direct result of historical whaling, might not show its full impact for many more years. Some specialist species could already be sliding slowly toward extinction, even while scientists continue discovering and documenting new species living on the whale falls that remain. This creates an unusual kind of urgency around protecting whale populations today. Conserving whales is not just about the animals themselves, as important as that is on its own. It is also about protecting an entire hidden ecosystem built on their eventual deaths, a system stretching across the deep ocean floor that most people will never see or even know exists. Because it turns out that one whale, one single body reaching the bottom of the ocean, matters for far more than just the animals feeding on it directly. A single whale carcass does something that reaches far beyond its own skeleton. Throughout this story, we have focused closely on one whale fall, following it from the moment of death through decades of decay. But whales, while they are alive, already play an enormous role in ocean health, long before their bodies ever reach the seafloor. As whales dive deep to feed and return to the surface to breathe, they carry nutrients upward from the depths, releasing waste near the surface that helps fertilize the growth of tiny, sunlight-powered plankton. This process, sometimes called the whale pump by researchers, helps support entire food chains near the ocean's surface, feeding everything from small fish to seabirds. Whales also travel enormous distances during their lives, migrating between feeding grounds and breeding grounds, spreading nutrients across huge stretches of ocean along the way. A single whale can distribute nutrients across thousands of miles over the course of its life, connecting distant ocean regions in ways few other animals can match. Then, after death, that same whale continues contributing to ocean life for decades longer through the entire process described throughout this story. Scavengers, bone-eating worms, chemosynthetic bacteria, clams, mussels, and dozens of specialized species all depend, directly or indirectly, on that one body reaching the seafloor. Scientists sometimes describe whales as playing an outsized role in what they call the ocean's carbon cycle as well. Whale bodies contain large amounts of carbon, built up over their lifetimes. When a whale dies naturally and sinks to the deep sea floor, much of that carbon becomes locked away at the bottom of the ocean for an extremely long time, rather than cycling back into the atmosphere. Multiply this effect across the historical scale of whale populations before large-scale hunting began, and researchers estimate that whales likely played a meaningful role in helping regulate carbon storage across the entire ocean, an effect that shrank significantly as whale numbers dropped. This wider picture helps explain why scientists studying whale falls often describe their research as connecting to much bigger questions about ocean health overall. A whale is not simply one large animal living somewhere out in the open ocean. It is a nutrient carrier while alive, and a long-term ecosystem builder after death, supporting deep-sea life for decades through a process most people will never witness firsthand. Protecting whale populations today, then, ripples outward across the entire ocean system, from surface-dwelling plankton all the way down to bone-eating worms working through a skeleton more than a mile below the waves. And as researchers continue studying whale falls scattered across the planet, one particular question keeps resurfacing, tied directly to just how long these strange hidden ecosystems can actually last. Some whale falls last longer than the whale that created them ever lived. This idea sounds almost impossible at first. A whale might live for several decades, sometimes 80 years or more depending on the species, growing, migrating, and raising offspring across an entire lifetime spent swimming through the ocean. It seems strange that its remains, resting motionless on the seafloor, could somehow outlast that entire living history. But that is exactly what researchers have documented at multiple whale fall sites studied over long periods of time. The sulfophilic stage, the slow chemically powered phase filled with bacterial mats, clams, mussels, and bone-eating worms, represents by far the longest chapter in the entire whale fall process. While the earlier scavenger stage might last only a year or two, and while bone-eating worms may work through much of the accessible fat within several more years after that, this final, slower stage can continue for multiple decades. In some documented cases, researchers tracking a single whale skeleton over an extended period found active chemosynthetic communities still thriving after more than 30 years, with signs suggesting the process could continue for a decade or two beyond that before the skeleton's fat reserves finally run out completely. Certain estimates, based on bone density and lipid content in particularly large whale species, suggest some skeletons could theoretically support this final stage for close to a century, an almost unbelievable stretch of time for a single dead animal to continue shaping the ecosystem around it. Picture that scale for a moment. A whale might live 80 years, experiencing decades of migration, feeding, and reproduction. After death, its skeleton could continue supporting an entire complex ecosystem for potentially just as long, or even longer, sitting motionless in total darkness the entire time. This detail changes how scientists think about what a whale's life actually means for the broader ocean. Its influence does not end the moment its heart stops beating. In some ways, its greatest ecological impact might not even begin until after it dies, when its body reaches the seafloor and begins the long process described throughout this story. Researchers studying these long-term whale falls have had to develop new methods just to keep observing the same skeleton over such extended time frames, returning to the exact same coordinates on the seafloor year after year, sometimes decade after decade, using increasingly advanced submarines and remote cameras to track how the community around each skeleton continues shifting and changing. This long-term tracking has revealed something else remarkable, evidence stretching back far beyond modern research entirely, buried not in the ocean, but in solid rock. Because whale falls, it turns out, are not just a modern phenomenon happening somewhere out in today's oceans. They have been happening for millions of years. Long before any submarine ever photographed a whale fall, evidence of this exact process was already sitting quietly inside solid rock, waiting to be discovered. Fossil hunters studying ancient marine rock formations have found something remarkable in certain locations. Fossilized whale skeletons, some dating back roughly 30 million years, showing clear signs of the exact same chemosynthetic community structure documented on modern whale falls today. Tiny fossilized shells belonging to relatives of the same clam and mussel species found at modern whale falls turn up clustered around these ancient bones. Trace fossils, essentially fossilized evidence of burrowing and boring activity, closely resembling the damage caused by modern bone-eating worms, have been identified in some of these ancient whale skeletons as well. This evidence suggests something remarkable about how long this particular ecosystem has existed. The strange, chemically powered community of life we have followed throughout this story is not some recent development. It appears to have been unfolding on the ocean floor for tens of millions of years, quietly repeating itself every time a large whale died and sank, long before humans existed to witness any of it. This deep history connects directly back to the stepping stone theory discussed earlier, linking whale falls to hydrothermal vents. If whale falls have existed for tens of millions of years, they may have been serving as chemical stepping stones across the ocean for an extraordinarily long stretch of evolutionary time, potentially helping shape how chemosynthetic life spread and diversified across different regions of the deep sea throughout that entire period. Researchers studying these ancient fossils have also noted something else worth mentioning. The timing of when whalefall-related fossils first begin appearing in the rock record lines up reasonably well with when whales themselves first evolved into the large ocean-dwelling giants recognizable today. This suggests that as whales grew larger over evolutionary time, an entire specialized ecosystem may have grown right alongside them, evolving in tandem, entirely dependent on the whales' massive size and their eventual deaths at sea. Considering this deep history changes how you might picture a single whale fall happening right now, somewhere out in the ocean today. It is not an isolated, unusual event. It is the latest occurrence in a process that has been repeating itself, largely unchanged for tens of millions of years, connecting today's deep sea directly back to an ancient, ongoing relationship between whales and the ecosystems that depend on their deaths. But this ancient, deeply rooted cycle now faces something it has never encountered before across its entire multi-million-year history: humans. For tens of millions of years, the cycle connecting dying whales to deep-sea ecosystems continued largely undisturbed. Whales lived, migrated, and eventually died, sometimes from old age, sometimes from disease or predators, their bodies periodically sinking to the seafloor and setting off the long layered process described throughout this story. This pattern repeated itself across the entire span of whale evolution, shaping deep-sea ecosystems that came to depend on it completely. Then, starting roughly 2 centuries ago, that ancient pattern encountered a disruption unlike anything it had faced before. Commercial whaling expanded dramatically during the 1800s, driven by growing demand for whale oil, which was widely used at the time to fuel lamps and lubricate machinery during a period of rapid industrial growth. Whaling ships spread across nearly every ocean on the planet, targeting the largest whale species specifically because their size meant more oil per animal. Over the following century, whaling technology improved dramatically, from hand-thrown harpoons to explosive harpoon cannons mounted on fast steam-powered ships, allowing whaling operations to catch far more whales, far more efficiently than ever before. The impact on whale populations was severe. Several species were hunted to a small fraction of their original numbers before international agreements eventually placed serious restrictions on commercial whaling during the second half of the 20th century. This dramatic drop in whale populations did not just affect whales themselves. It disrupted the entire natural cycle of whale falls feeding the deep seafloor. Fewer whales alive meant, quite simply, fewer whales eventually dying and sinking to the ocean floor, breaking a chain of events that had continued largely uninterrupted since long before humans existed. Researchers studying whale falls today have to reckon with this disruption directly. The whale fall communities scientists observe now, however rich and fascinating they appear, likely represent a smaller, more scattered version of what this ecosystem once looked like before commercial whaling reduced whale populations so dramatically across the globe. Some whale populations have shown encouraging signs of recovery since major hunting restrictions took effect. certain species that were once pushed to the edge of extinction have slowly rebuilt their numbers over recent decades, offering some hope that this ancient cycle could eventually recover as well. But recovery remains slow and uneven across different species and different regions of the world. Some populations, especially in parts of the Southern Hemisphere and North Pacific, remain well below historical numbers, meaning the deep-sea specialists depending on regular whale falls in those particular regions may still be waiting for a recovery that has not fully arrived yet. This raises an uncomfortable, lingering question that connects directly back to the extinction debt described earlier in this story. If whale populations only partially recover, does that mean the ancient cycle connecting whales to the deep sea floor only partially recovers as well, potentially leaving some specialist species permanently stranded with too few whale falls to sustain their population long term? Researchers do not yet have a complete answer, but the science makes one thing increasingly clear. Picture an ocean where far fewer whales die naturally each year, scattered across a smaller number of locations than in the past. For deep-sea specialist species, this reduced version of the whalefall cycle presents a serious long-term challenge. Fewer skeletons landing on the seafloor means fewer opportunities for drifting larvae to find a fresh whale fall before their limited energy reserves run out. Fewer available whale falls also likely means those that do exist face more crowding and stronger competition among the species trying to colonize them. Over time, this could mean shrinking populations for species that depend most heavily on this narrow, specialized habitat, potentially pushing some toward extinction long before scientists have even finished documenting and understanding them. This concern carries extra weight considering how recently researchers discovered many of these species in the first place. Osedax worms were not identified until the early 2000s. Numerous related species have continued turning up in research surveys conducted just within the past couple of decades. It seems entirely possible that some whalefall specialists could disappear before scientists ever get the chance to study them, or in some cases, even discover that they existed at all. Researchers studying whale falls have started raising this exact concern in scientific publications, urging careful consideration of how future decisions around whale hunting and ocean protection could directly affect this hidden ecosystem, one that remains almost entirely invisible to most people, tucked away more than a mile beneath the ocean's surface. This creates an unusual kind of conservation challenge. Unlike a forest or a coral reef, which people can see, visit, and directly witness being damaged or restored, whalefall ecosystems exist in complete darkness, at extreme depth, largely inaccessible without specialized deep-sea research equipment. Most people will never see one directly, and most decisions affecting whale populations happen without this deep-sea consequence ever entering the conversation at all. Yet the connection remains real and measurable. Every decision that affects how many whales survive, how many reach old age, how many die naturally at sea rather than through human causes, ripples directly down into an ecosystem that has depended on that exact cycle for tens of millions of years. Some scientists studying this topic describe whalefall ecosystems as a kind of hidden indicator, a signal buried deep in the ocean that reflects the overall health of whale populations far more broadly. A thriving, diverse whalefall community might suggest whale populations in that region remain healthy and abundant. A sparse, struggling community might suggest the opposite. Continued research into whalefalls, then, offers more than just fascinating discoveries about strange worms and chemical-powered clams. It offers a window into the broader health of the ocean itself, one carcass at a time, one hidden ecosystem at a time. And that window keeps revealing just how much weight a single whale's death can carry, stretching far beyond anything visible from the surface. Step back now and look at the full scope of everything one whale's death sets in motion. Within hours, sharks and hagfish detect the carcass from miles away, launching a feeding frenzy that can strip an entire body of soft tissue within roughly 2 years. Hundreds of individual scavengers may feed on a single carcass during this stage, temporarily transforming a quiet patch of seafloor into one of the busiest feeding grounds in the deep ocean. Once the flesh is gone, an entirely different chapter begins. Strange, mouthless worms, discovered completely by accident just over 2 decades ago, bore directly into the bones, using bacterial partners to unlock fat and oil that would otherwise remain permanently out of reach. As that bacterial process continues, it releases a toxic gas that would kill most life on the planet. Yet in the deep sea, that same gas becomes fuel, powering chemosynthetic bacteria capable of building an entire food web with no sunlight involved at all. Clams and mussels, hosting bacteria directly inside their own bodies, form dense colonies feeding on that chemical energy, echoing similar communities found at hydrothermal vents thousands of miles away, hinting at an ancient hidden connection stretching across the deep ocean floor. This entire process, layered stage after stage, can continue for decades. In some cases, potentially close to a century, a single skeleton continues shaping the ecosystem around it, long after the whale that once carried that skeleton has been gone. And this is not some rare, isolated occurrence limited to recent scientific discovery. Fossil evidence shows this exact process repeating itself for tens of millions of years, connecting today's deep ocean directly back to an ancient relationship between whales and the specialized life that depends on their eventual deaths. Yet this ancient cycle now faces real pressure, a direct consequence of roughly 2 centuries of commercial whaling that dramatically reduced whale populations across the globe. Fewer whales today likely means fewer whale falls reaching the seafloor, which likely means increasing pressure on specialist species that depend entirely on this unpredictable scattered habitat to survive. All of this traces back to one single event. One whale dying somewhere in the vast open ocean, its body beginning a slow fall through total darkness toward the seafloor far below. That single death does not simply end one animal's story. It launches an entire cascade of life, unfolding in stages, supporting hundreds of species, some found absolutely nowhere else on the planet, stretching across a timeline longer than most human lives. Understanding this connection reshapes how you might think about whales altogether, not just as massive, majestic animals swimming somewhere out in the ocean, but as long-term architects of an entire hidden world, one that continues building itself for decades after the whale itself is gone, and that hidden world, quiet, dark, and largely unseen, is still out there right now, somewhere on the ocean floor, continuing exactly as it has for millions of years. Somewhere in the ocean today, a whale skeleton rests on the seafloor, more than a mile beneath the surface, in complete darkness. Maybe it landed there decades ago. Maybe scavengers stripped its flesh years before you were even born. Maybe bone-eating worms have already spent a decade boring through its ribs, and thick bacterial mats now spread across bones that once carried a living, breathing animal through open ocean. Clams and mussels may be clustered around its base right now, quietly converting toxic gas into energy, feeding an entire community that will never see a single ray of sunlight. Crabs may be picking across its surface. Somewhere nearby, drifting larvae may be searching, right this second, for exactly this kind of skeleton, hoping to settle before their limited energy runs out. This has been happening in various forms, in various locations across the ocean, for tens of millions of years. Long before submarines existed to photograph it, long before scientists even suspected it was happening at all. A quiet, hidden cycle, repeating itself again and again, entirely out of view. We began this story with a single whale, its heart stopping somewhere in the open ocean, its body beginning a long fall through total darkness. That moment looked, on the surface, like nothing more than an ending. It was not. That single body went on to feed sharks and hagfish for 2 years. It supported bone-eating worms discovered by complete accident. Worms so strange they required an entirely new scientific category just to describe them. It produced a toxic gas that became the fuel for clams and mussels living without sunlight, echoing ancient chemical ecosystems found at volcanic vents scattered across the ocean floor. It built piece by piece, stage by stage, an entire self-contained world, one that continued growing and shifting for decades, quietly outlasting the whale's own lifetime. And all of this happened because of hunting practices that dramatically reduced whale populations, and this hidden ecosystem now depends on whether those populations continue recovering in the years ahead. Every whale swimming through the ocean today carries this same potential, an entire hidden future written into its enormous body, waiting for the moment, possibly decades away, when it will finally sink and begin building a world of its own on the seafloor below. That world will not care whether anyone above ever knows it exists. It will not need sunlight, or attention, or witnesses. It will simply continue, exactly as this exact process has continued for tens of millions of years, one skeleton at a time, one dark ecosystem at a time, quietly shaping the deep ocean from below. A single death, falling through the dark, and somehow, from that single death, an entire world begins.